My name is Harold Mason. I am 74 years old, and for most of my life I have considered myself a man who could adapt to changes with a certain quiet stubbornness. I was never particularly quick to embrace new things, but I never rejected them either. If something was necessary, I would learn it in my own slow and steady way. That was true when my company replaced the old adding machines with early computers back in the 1980s, and it remained true when, after my retirement, the world suddenly shifted almost entirely onto screens, codes, and networks that seemed to spin faster than I could keep up with. Since my wife Eleanor passed away 9 years ago, the house has been too silent, and though I had once promised her I would never let loneliness define me, I have found myself more and more confined to this small home on the edge of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, with the same old kitchen table, the same faded curtains, and the same evening routine of heating soup, reading the newspaper, and falling asleep to the sound of the radio humming the news. The days blend together in that quiet way the elderly know so well, where time is no longer a march forward, but a circling rhythm of habits, memories, and small duties meant to give shape to the otherwise shapeless expanse of retirement. I try to keep myself useful. I mow the little patch of lawn when my knees allow it, shovel snow from the porch in winter, and keep Eleanor's rose bushes trimmed, though the flowers are less generous with me than they ever were with her. Sometimes neighbors wave from their driveways and I wave back, and occasionally I am invited to the church's community breakfasts, where old men like myself exchange polite words about arthritis, grandchildren, and the rising price of groceries. My daughter Margaret phones me about once a week, usually in a rush between work calls, her voice distracted but dutiful. She brings my grandson Derek around a handful of times each year, usually when she needs someone to look after him while she attends conferences or weekend meetings. Derek is 16 now, lanky and restless, forever with a phone in his hand, tapping and swiping with the speed of someone who was practically born inside the digital world. He reminds me of Margaret at that age, sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, impatient with everything slow or old. But where Margaret's impatience was softened by her mother's steady kindness, Derek's feels sharpened, edged with the scorn of youth that believes age is a form of failure. I am aware that I am not the kind of grandfather boys brag about. I do not take him fishing because my knees are unreliable, and I cannot throw a football the way I once did when I coached his mother's schoolyard games. He calls me Grandpa Harry, but always with a half smile, as though the title itself were a joke. When I try to ask him about his life, his classes, or his friends, his answers are short, and his eyes drift quickly back to the glowing rectangle in his hand, where conversations and images move faster than any sentence I can manage. Once, when I asked him if he ever read the book stacked on his desk at home, he laughed and said, "Nobody reads books anymore, Grandpa. Everything's online." When I admitted that I still preferred the feel of a newspaper in the morning, he snorted and said, "That's so ancient. You know you could just get the news on your phone, right?" And though I tried to laugh with him, something in me flinched, as though I had been placed in the museum of his mind, alongside typewriters and rotary telephones. Life as a widower has taught me to endure these small humiliations with patience. After Eleanor's death, there was a period when I thought the silence of the house would bury me. I would wake in the middle of the night reaching for her hand, only to find the sheets cold. The radio programs I once enjoyed became unbearable because they reminded me of evenings when we would sit together, she knitting while I worked crossword puzzles. I survived by creating rituals, by filling the day with repetitions that kept grief at bay. Morning coffee brewed in the pot she bought 30 years ago, oatmeal with a teaspoon of honey, a short walk down the block to pick up the mail even when there was nothing waiting but bills and advertisements. I thought perhaps Margaret and Derek would grow closer after her mother's passing, that grief would soften whatever distance had grown between us. But the opposite happened. Margaret threw herself into work, traveling more, calling less, and Derek, who was only 7 when Eleanor died, barely remembers her kindness, her warm laughter, her insistence that family must always look after each other. To him, I am just the old man at the edge of his schedule, a reluctant babysitter when convenient, someone to be tolerated but not admired. Still, I try. I make sure to have Derek's favorite sodas in the fridge when Margaret drops him off, though he never thanks me. I listen patiently when he talks about his projects, though I understand only half of what he means when he says he's trading digital coins or setting up an online store. I nod when he brags about the money he claims to make, though I suspect it is more illusion than reality. The truth is, I envy his confidence. At 16, to believe the world bends to your thumbs, that you can earn wealth and respect by pressing buttons, it must feel intoxicating. When I was his age, my father had me sweeping factory floors for 20 cents an hour, and I thought myself lucky. Times change, and perhaps it is natural for the young to dismiss the old as obsolete. But there is a cruelty in the speed of that dismissal that I feel more keenly with each visit. In my quieter moments, when I sit in the recliner by the window and watch the world move on without me, I wonder whether Derek will ever know the loneliness that creeps into old age. I wonder if he will one day look at his own hands, slowed by arthritis, and recall the days when they flew over screens with effortless speed. I wonder if he will remember that his grandfather once tried, clumsily and stubbornly, to keep up with him. Or perhaps he will only remember the punchline, "Grandpa can't even use Wi-Fi," and nothing else. That is the fear that coils inside me, that I will not be remembered as a man who worked 40 years to provide for his family, who stood by his wife through sickness and health, who endured the weight of solitude with dignity, but only as the butt of a teenager's joke about technology. This, then, is the stage of my life when the story begins. An old man in a quiet house, with a heart still heavy from absence, a family grown distant, and a grandson who looks at him not with admiration or affection, but with the sneer of superiority. It is a house where silence presses against the walls, where the past lingers in photographs and empty chairs, and where each day begins with the stubborn determination to hold on to dignity in the face of invisibility. I do not know yet how much that determination will be tested, or how deep the wound of mockery will cut, but I feel already that something is shifting in the stillness, some gathering storm that will force me out of resignation and into a confrontation I never sought but can no longer avoid. It was on one of those early summer evenings, when the air was heavy with the smell of cut grass and the sound of children riding bicycles in the street, that the moment which changed the rhythm of my quiet life occurred, though at first it seemed nothing more than another routine dinner with Margaret and Derek. A family gathering to which I had clung with the naive hope that it might remind us all of who we were supposed to be to each other. Margaret had called the day before, her tone brisk as usual, telling me she and Derek would stop by after his baseball practice, and I had busied myself all morning preparing a roast in Eleanor's old pot, peeling carrots and potatoes with hands, slower than they once were. Setting the table with the good china because I still cling to the belief that family meals deserve a certain dignity no matter how rare they have become. I even polished the silverware, an act that felt ceremonial, a way of summoning Eleanor's spirit into the room, as though she might sit with us again if everything looked just right. By the time Margaret's car pulled into the driveway, the house smelled rich with garlic and thyme, and I had smoothed my shirt, brushed the crumbs from my trousers, and told myself that perhaps this evening would not dissolve into the usual quick meal, distracted chatter, and hurried goodbyes. Derek came in first, tall and restless, his baseball cap tilted back on his head, his phone already in his hand before he had crossed the threshold. He barely glanced at me as he mumbled a hello, his eyes fixed on the screen where some video blared loudly enough for me to catch fragments of crude laughter and rapid voices. Margaret followed, balancing a briefcase and her purse, giving me a quick peck on the cheek before setting her things down with the sigh of a woman who carries the weight of both work and motherhood, like an endless burden. I tried not to notice the way her eyes flicked to the clock, as though she were already calculating how soon she might leave. We sat down at the table, plates of food steaming before us, and for a while I attempted to maintain the illusion of warmth, asking Derek about his game, Margaret about her latest project at work, and filling the silences with small stories from my own week. Derek responded with shrugs and grunts, never lifting his eyes from his phone, while Margaret answered politely but without interest, her mind clearly elsewhere. It was when I asked Derek if he might put his phone away during dinner, just so we could talk a little, that the catalyst came, sudden and sharp as a slap. He looked at me, his eyes filled with that exasperated superiority only the young can wield, and he said, loud enough for his mother to hear, but with his gaze locked on me as though challenging me, "Grandpa, you can't even use Wi-Fi." What could we possibly talk about? The words fell into the room with a thud heavier than their simplicity suggested. Margaret gave a nervous laugh, muttered something about teenagers and their mouths, but she did not correct him, she did not scold him, she did not come to my defense. Derek leaned back in his chair with a smirk, proud of his cleverness, and for a moment I could not speak, my throat tightening as if the air itself had been stolen. I thought of all the nights Eleanor and I had sat at this very table, her hands folded neatly as she asked about my day, her eyes shining with the simple respect of partnership, and how far away that feeling seemed now. To be mocked by one's own flesh and blood, to be reduced to a punchline in front of one's daughter, who should have remembered better, who should have defended me, was a humiliation that cut deeper than any insult from a stranger. I managed to clear my throat and say softly, "I may not know much about Wi-Fi, but I know about life, Derek." He rolled his eyes and muttered, "Yeah, sure," before turning back to his phone, dismissing me completely. The rest of the dinner passed in strained silence, to once, broken only by the clink of forks and the occasional beep of Derek's notifications. Margaret tried once or twice to redirect the conversation, but it was half-hearted, and I could feel her unease growing as if she feared that addressing the disrespect would prolong the evening rather than heal it. When the plates were cleared, she gathered her things quickly, thanking me for the meal with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek, her mind already moving to her next task. Derek brushed past me on his way to the door, earbuds already in place, his world sealed away from mine, and I stood in the quiet kitchen, staring at the dishes stacked in the sink, wondering at what point the bond of family had become so brittle that a boy could mock his grandfather in his own house without consequence. That night I could not sleep. I lay in bed listening to the old clock tick on the wall, each second like a drop of water wearing down stone, and the words replayed in my mind with cruel persistence. "You can't even use Wi-Fi." It was not just a joke, it was a verdict, a declaration that I no longer belonged to the world as it was now shaped, that my value was measured by a technology I had not mastered, that I was obsolete, a relic to be pitied or ridiculed, but never respected. I thought of Eleanor, of how she would have bristled at such insolence, how she would have defended me with the quiet authority only she possessed, and the absence of her voice in that moment of humiliation felt like a second loss, layered upon the first. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the dusty laptop Margaret had once bought me years ago, a machine I had rarely used except to occasionally look at photographs she sent or to watch the occasional video she insisted would amuse me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, the screen glowing to life, demanding passwords and updates I could barely remember. I sat there for hours, determined and humiliated at once, clicking through menus, trying to connect to the very Wi-Fi I had been mocked for not understanding. The process was maddening, and more than once I nearly closed the lid in defeat, but each time Derek's smirk flashed in my mind, each time I heard again the dismissive tone of his voice. And I forced myself to continue, to press on, until at last the little bars on the corner of the screen glowed strong and steady. I had connected, and though it was a small victory, it felt like reclaiming a piece of dignity that had been stripped from me. It would have been easy to dismiss the moment as just another episode in the long friction between generations, to tell myself that all teenagers mock their elders, that all families carry these little wounds. But something in me shifted that night. Perhaps it was the weight of accumulated neglect, years of feeling like an afterthought in my daughter's life, or perhaps it was simply the loneliness of an old man who had endured too many quiet dinners alone. Whatever the reason, Derek's words did not fade as so many others had. They lodged in me, like a splinter, festering, demanding action. I realized that if I allowed myself to remain the butt of such jokes, if I accepted the role of the obsolete fool, then I would spend the rest of my days shrinking into that silence, until nothing of Harold Mason remained but a forgotten name in a dusty family album. And so the catalyst was not simply Derek's cruel remark, but the realization it sparked that my life, even in its waning years, could not be allowed to dissolve into irrelevance, that I had to prove, to myself most of all, that I was not finished. That knowledge and dignity did not belong solely to the young, that even an old man could learn, adapt, and hold his head high. It was a quiet resolution, formed in the stillness of a lonely bedroom, but it carried with it the force of something that would alter the course of my remaining years, pushing me into places I had never imagined, into discoveries both painful and liberating, and into a confrontation with my family that would reveal truths none of us were prepared to face. In the days that followed that humiliating dinner, I carried Derek's words with me, like a stone in my pocket, heavy and abrasive, wearing down my patience each time I remembered them, and though I tried to tell myself I was being oversensitive, that teenagers were cruel by instinct, and my daughter's silence had been the silence of exhaustion rather than complicity, the memory would not release me. It returned in the quiet moments, when I sat on the porch with the newspaper, when I brewed my morning coffee, when I stood in the grocery store line fumbling with my wallet as younger customers tapped their cards against the machine without hesitation, and it whispered that Derek was right, that I was a man who had slipped behind the world, a man who could not even command the simplest tool of modern life. And yet, alongside the shame, another sensation grew: stubbornness. The same stubbornness that had carried me through decades of accounting work, balancing columns of numbers until my eyes blurred, refusing to accept defeat until every cent was accounted for. I decided that if my grandson wished to measure my worth against his world of Wi-Fi and screens, then I would meet him there, not for his approval, but for my own. I began quietly, without announcing my intentions to anyone, because I knew that if Margaret discovered me fumbling with the computer, she would insist I was wasting my time, and if Derek heard of it, he would only mock me further. I dusted off the laptop that had been sitting untouched for months on the shelf, charged it overnight, and sat at the kitchen table the next morning, staring at the glowing screen as though it were a battlefield. The machine demanded updates, accounts, and passwords I barely remembered, but I persevered, digging through old notebooks where Eleanor and I had scribbled reminders in cramped handwriting, finding scraps of paper tucked into cookbooks with codes, written in faded ink, piecing together the fragments of my forgotten digital life. There were moments of pure frustration when I felt like hurling the thing against the wall, when error messages mocked me as surely as Derek had, but each time I forced myself to breathe, to recall the hours I had once spent balancing ledgers long before calculators were common, and I pressed on. It was during these first halting steps into the digital world that the first signs of deeper conflict began to surface. Margaret stopped by one afternoon unannounced and found me hunched over the computer, squinting at the screen with my glasses sliding down my nose. Dad? What on earth are you doing? She asked, her voice tinged with exasperation, as though she had caught me in some childish mischief. When I explained that I was trying to learn how to use the computer properly, she laughed softly, shaking her head. At your age? Dad, it's not worth the stress. You'll just confuse yourself. Leave that stuff to Derek. He was born with it in his hands. I smiled faintly and told her I just wanted to be able to send an email without calling her for help. But inside, I felt the sting of her words, the dismissal not unlike her son's, as though my attempt to remain relevant was a foolish vanity. She stayed only long enough to drop off some files she needed me to store, then left in a rush, promising to call but never doing so. Her reaction might have been enough to dissuade me in the past, but something in me had hardened since that dinner. Each evening I returned to the computer, watching tutorials, scribbling notes, forcing my fingers to learn the unfamiliar rhythm of shortcuts and passwords. Slowly, painfully, I made progress. I learned how to connect to the wireless network that hummed invisibly through the house. I created an email account that was mine alone. And I even managed to download the digital version of the newspaper, though I still preferred the crinkle of real pages. And with each small triumph came a growing sense of power, as though I were reclaiming territory that had been stolen from me, proving that the mind may age but does not wither if it is given a challenge. It was around this time that Derek came to stay for a weekend while Margaret traveled for work. And though I told myself I would not rise to his provocations, fate had other plans. The first evening, after a dinner of hamburgers I grilled on the old iron pan, Derek sprawled on the couch with his phone while I sat across from him with the laptop balanced on my knees, determined to practice. At first he ignored me, but when the screen froze and I muttered under my breath, he looked up with a smirk. "What are you even trying to do, Grandpa?" he asked. I told him I was setting up an online account for bill payments, something I had always done by check. He snorted. "You? Pay bills online? You'll probably lock yourself out and call Mom crying. Seriously, just leave it." "You're too old for that." His laughter filled the room, careless and cruel, and though I tried to remain calm, my hands trembled on the keyboard. Later that night, after Derek had gone to bed, I passed by the guest room and heard his voice through the door. Curious, I paused, realizing he was on a call with a friend, and though I knew it was wrong to eavesdrop, the words I caught froze me in place. "Yeah, I'm stuck here for the weekend." The old man's hopeless. He spent like 2 hours trying to connect to Wi-Fi. Can you believe it? He'll be dead soon anyway. And Mom says the house will be mine. Can't wait. He laughed then, a laugh that twisted something inside me, and his friend joined in. I stood in the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe to steady myself, my heart thudding with a mixture of anger and grief. To be mocked was one thing, but to hear my grandson speak of my death so casually, to reduce my existence to the future acquisition of a house, was a betrayal I had not been prepared for. I returned to my room and sat in the dark, staring at Eleanor's photograph on the nightstand, whispering to her memory that our love, our years of work and sacrifice had led only to this. A daughter who dismissed me, a grandson who laughed at my mortality. The following morning, when Derek emerged yawning and asked if I had breakfast ready, I looked at him differently, with a kind of quiet distance. I still cooked him eggs and toast, but as he devoured them without thanks, I studied the boy he had become and wondered where the line had been crossed, where respect had been lost. My resolve deepened then. I would not be erased by his scorn. I would not let him stand over my grave one day and remember me only as the punchline of a joke about Wi-Fi. If he wanted to measure my worth against the tools of his generation, then I would show him that an old man could still learn, still fight, still matter. And so the first escalation of our unspoken conflict was not in words, but in silence, in the decision I made to continue pushing forward despite their mockery. I spent long nights hunched over that glowing screen, my eyes aching, my fingers stiff, but I learned. I set up accounts, I explored websites, I even created a password manager so I would not lose my way again. The more I learned, the more I realized how much of life had moved into this invisible world Derek thought belonged to him alone. Banking, communication, even medical records. It was there, in that labyrinth of logins and codes, that I would find the key to the next chapter, though I did not yet know it. All I knew then was that my dignity depended on continuing, and that Derek's careless cruelty had awakened something in me that would not rest until justice was restored, even if only within my own heart. It was during one of those restless nights, when the house felt too large and the silence too heavy, that the turning point of my story revealed itself, unexpected and unsettling, like a locked door I stumbled upon in a house I thought I knew. I had grown more confident with the computer, enough that I no longer feared breaking it with every click, and one evening I opened the browser and found the memory of a saved login waiting for me. The account name was Derek's, though he had never once asked to use my old laptop, and curiosity, mingled with the bitterness of his earlier mockery, led me to press enter. To my surprise, the screen filled with his online banking dashboard, a neat list of balances and transactions that looked almost professional, as though a boy of 16 had somehow become a financier. At first I felt ashamed, as if I had stumbled into a private room where I did not belong. But the thought of his laughter, of the contempt in his voice when he spoke of me as a man already half dead, pushed me to look closer. What I saw made my stomach turn. The amounts were too large for a teenager to earn honestly, thousands of dollars flowing in at irregular intervals, tagged with vague references that hinted at something darker. There were deposits from names that sounded too similar to be real, followed by rapid withdrawals, transfers to digital wallets, and purchases of expensive items shipped to addresses I did not recognize. I scrolled through the list, my hands trembling as the truth became clear. Derek was not earning money through clever online businesses as he had boasted, but through schemes that smelled of fraud, deception, perhaps even theft. I thought of his expensive sneakers, the flashy phone he had upgraded twice in a single year, the smug way he declared he was building his future while mocking my inability to connect to Wi-Fi, and suddenly all of it fell into place. He was not merely a careless boy intoxicated by technology. He was a child dabbling in something that could ruin lives, his own included. For a long time I sat at the table staring at the screen, torn between anger and despair. Part of me wanted to slam the laptop shut, to pretend I had never seen any of it, because to confront Derek would mean tearing open wounds already festering in the family. Margaret would deny it, or worse, defend him, accusing me of exaggeration or misunderstanding, as she always had when I tried to point out his arrogance. Yet another part of me, the part that had spent decades safeguarding other people's money in meticulous ledgers, could not ignore the crime unfolding in front of me. I knew too well what fraud looked like. Salwisiwas Wakabo, the subtle disguises in transaction notes, the deliberate scattering of amounts meant to avoid detection, and I knew that one day soon the bank or the authorities would notice, And when they did, it would not be me or Margaret who suffered the consequences, but Derek himself. I rose from the table and paced the kitchen, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. Eleanor's photograph on the wall watching me, with the same calm patience she had always carried. What would she have done, I wondered, faced with the knowledge that her grandson was not only disrespectful but dishonest? She would not have stayed silent. She would have insisted that truth, however painful, was better than lies. And yet, the thought of Margaret's face, tight with disappointment, her words sharp with accusation, made me hesitate. For years, she had looked at me as though I were a burden she could not quite abandon. And if I accused her son, she might very well sever what thin thread of connection remained between us. But the turning point was not whether I would act. I knew, deep down, that I could not allow fraud to continue under my roof, even indirectly. The real turning point was the recognition of what Derek's mockery had truly meant. It was not just youthful arrogance, it was projection, a shield of superiority to hide the rot beneath, because he, the boy who mocked me for being unable to use Wi-Fi, was using that same Wi-Fi not to build, but to steal, not to create, but to deceive. The hypocrisy struck me like a revelation, and suddenly his laughter, his contempt, his casual words about inheriting my house all seemed less like youthful ignorance and more like the arrogance of someone convinced he was untouchable, that rules were for others, not for him. I spent the rest of the night gathering what I could. I printed transaction histories, took screenshots, wrote down account numbers, my hands steady with the calm of an old man who has balanced many ledgers and knows how to preserve evidence. Each page I stacked on the table felt like another stone in a wall I was building, a defense not only for myself, but for Derek, though he would never see it that way. By the time dawn broke and the first birds began to sing, I knew there would be no going back. I had crossed into knowledge that demanded action, knowledge that would transform our strained family into something even more fractured, perhaps irreparably. When Margaret called later that day, her voice rushed as always, asking if I could watch Derek the following weekend. I found myself pausing before answering. I wanted to tell her everything, to spill the truth into the phone, to force her to hear the reality of her son's secret life. But I did not. Instead, I agreed, my voice calm. And when I hung up the phone, I realized why. The time for words was not yet here. The time for confrontation would come soon, but it had to be done face to face, with proof laid bare, with no room for denial. And so I waited, carrying the weight of my discovery in silence, knowing that the boy who had laughed at me for not understanding Wi-Fi had no idea that his grandfather now held the key to unraveling his carefully constructed illusions. The following weekend arrived heavy with tension I could not name aloud, though I felt it in every motion as I tidied the house, set fresh sheets on the guest bed, and stocked the pantry with the sodas Derek liked, each task performed with the knowledge that I was no longer merely a grandfather preparing for a visit, but a man preparing for confrontation. I had my evidence stacked neatly in a folder inside the desk drawer, pages of transactions, screenshots of suspicious deposits and withdrawals, and notes written in my own hand to explain the patterns I recognized, the unmistakable fingerprints of fraud. Yet as I moved through the day, I asked myself again and again whether I had the strength to use them, whether I was truly willing to shatter what little remained of my family bond for the sake of exposing what I had seen. Eleanor's photograph on the mantel seemed to watch me with quiet insistence, reminding me that silence in the face of wrongdoing was complicity, and I told myself that I could not let the boy destroy himself without at least trying to pull him back from the brink, no matter how much he despised me. When Margaret dropped Derek off, She barely stepped inside, rushing off with a wave of her hand, already late for her conference. Derek entered the house with his usual distracted swagger, his earbuds in place, his phone glowing in his palm, and he offered me only the barest acknowledgement before heading straight to the guest room. I watched him disappear down the hallway, feeling both pity and anger. Pity for the boy he still was beneath the arrogance, and anger for the way he carried himself, as if the world were already his possession. That evening, we ate dinner in near silence. My attempts at conversation brushed aside with one-word answers, until at last he retreated to the couch, scrolling endlessly, while I sat across from him, with my folder of evidence burning like a weight on my lap. I might have confronted him then, demanded explanations, but instinct told me it was not yet the right moment. Instead, I watched, and as I watched, I noticed how often his phone buzzed with notifications, how quickly he tapped out responses, how his expression flickered with unease when certain messages appeared. Later, when he went to bed and left his phone charging in the kitchen, I passed by quietly and saw the screen light up with a name I did not recognize, followed by the words, "Need payment cleared by tomorrow." Don't mess this up. My heart tightened, for it confirmed what I already knew. Derek was not simply dabbling in harmless experiments, but entangled in something larger, something that involved others who might not be as forgiving as a family. The escalation came the next morning, when Derek, perhaps emboldened by his mother's absence, confronted me instead. He sauntered into the kitchen as I brewed coffee, glanced at the old watch on my wrist, a gift from Eleanor on our 25th anniversary, and said with a smirk, "You know, Grandpa, that watch is worth something. You should sell it. At least then you'd finally be useful." The words struck me like a blow, not only for their cruelty, but for the sheer audacity of suggesting I part with the last tangible memory of my wife, the one object I had promised myself would remain with me until my last breath. I set the coffee pot down carefully, my hands shaking, and asked him why he thought I should sell it. He shrugged, grinning. "Because you don't need it. You sit around this house all day doing nothing. You don't even know how to spend money. If you gave me the cash, I could invest it, make it grow. That's what people do now, Grandpa. They don't just let things sit around." Something inside me snapped then, not with violence, but with a cold clarity I had not felt in years. I looked at him steadily, the boy who bore my blood but not my respect, and realized that his greed, his arrogance, and his mockery had grown unchecked because no one had ever told him no, because Margaret excused him, because I endured him, because silence had allowed weeds to choke the garden of our family. I told him quietly but firmly that the watch was not for sale, that it never would be, and that he would do well to learn the difference between value and worth. He rolled his eyes, muttered something about old people and their sentimental junk, and stormed off, but I remained at the table, my decision finally formed. The time for silence was over. That afternoon I waited until he was absorbed in his phone, then called him into the kitchen. I placed the folder on the table, opened it to the first page of transactions, and told him to sit. At first he smirked, assuming I was about to bore him with some lesson about budgeting, but as his eyes fell on the pages, the smirk faltered. He flipped through the records, his face paling, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice sharper than I had ever heard it. I told him the truth, that his login had been saved on my computer, that curiosity had led me to look, and that what I found had left me no choice but to act. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and accused me of invading his privacy, of not understanding, of trying to ruin his life. I listened calmly, letting his anger wash over me, and when he was finished, I told him that privacy ended where crime began, that he might be my grandson, but I would not protect him from the consequences of fraud. His fury escalated, his words spilling out in a torrent of excuses and accusations. He claimed everyone did it, that it was just the hustle, that no one got hurt because the money came from faceless accounts or gullible strangers who deserved to lose it. I countered that lies and theft were still lies and theft, no matter how modern the disguise, and that if he continued down this path, he would not only destroy his own future, but drag Margaret into disgrace as well. For a moment he faltered, fear flickering in his eyes, but then arrogance returned and he sneered, "What are you going to do, Grandpa? Call the cops? No one will believe you. You don't even know how this stuff works." It was then that I laid the rest of the folder before him, the screenshots, the notes, the records, and told him that I knew enough to recognize patterns of fraud, that I had spent a lifetime auditing accounts, far more complex than his childish schemes, and that I would not hesitate to bring it all to the authorities if he did not stop. His bravado cracked then, and he sat down heavily, his head in his hands, muttering that he had no choice, that he was in too deep. Bit by bit the truth emerged. He had fallen in with older boys online, men who promised quick wealth if he acted as their middleman, funneling money through accounts, disguising transfers, and earning a cut for himself. At first it had seemed harmless, even exciting, but now he owed them favors he could not refuse, debts he could not pay, and he was terrified of what would happen if he backed out. As he spoke, I felt a complicated mixture of emotions: anger at his stupidity, pity for his fear, sorrow for the boy who had chosen deception over honesty. I told him that fear was no excuse, that mistakes could be corrected only if admitted, and that I would help him face the consequences, but only if he told the truth to his mother and ended his involvement immediately. He shook his head, insisting Margaret would never forgive him, that she would believe he was just a boy experimenting, and that if I told her, she would cut me out completely. I told him it was not my forgiveness he should fear losing, but his own future, and that the longer he delayed, the worse it would become. The escalation deepened that night when Margaret called to check in. Derek begged me not to tell her, his eyes wide with desperation, but I heard Eleanor's voice in my memory, reminding me that enabling a lie was the same as telling one. I nearly spoke the truth into the phone, but once again I held back, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew the time had not yet come. Margaret would defend him blindly if I simply accused him without proof. But if I confronted them together, with Derek present and the evidence undeniable, there would be no escape. So I told her only that Derek was fine, that we had spent the evening quietly, and when I hung up I saw both relief and resentment on his face. We spent the next day in uneasy silence, Derek alternating between sulking in his room and glancing nervously at me as if waiting for the hammer to fall. I could feel the distance between us stretching taut, ready to snap, and I knew that the second escalation of our conflict had moved us beyond repair. There was no returning to the days of polite pretense, no more pretending that we were simply a normal family with generational misunderstandings. The truth was now a living thing between us, demanding to be spoken, and when it was, it would either destroy us or free us, perhaps both. By the time Margaret returned to collect him, my decision was firm. I would not allow Derek's secret to remain hidden. The boy who mocked me for not understanding Wi-Fi had built his world on lies through that very network, and I, the man he dismissed as obsolete, now held the power to expose him. The only question remaining was how far he was willing to go to protect his illusion, and how far I was willing to go to preserve not only his future, but the dignity I had nearly allowed to slip away. The following morning, the house felt heavier than it ever had. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, every rustle of the old curtains in the breeze, every tick of the clock on the wall seemed to press upon me with a weight I hadn't anticipated, a weight that didn't come from the physical world, but from the decision I had made and the confrontation I knew was inevitable. Derek's presence, which had once been a source of mild discomfort, now felt like an electric charge that could short-circuit everything between us at any moment. He had retreated into silence, his phone in hand, but his eyes darting nervously as though he expected something to explode at any second. Margaret had already left for work, as she always did, with a hurried kiss, her mind absorbed with deadlines and meetings, leaving Derek and me alone in the house for what would soon be the most defining moment of our fractured relationship. I had spent the entire night thinking of what I would say, rehearsing the words in my mind like a speech that needed to be perfect. But the truth was, there was no perfect way to tell him what he needed to hear. No matter how carefully I chose my words, no matter how calmly I spoke, this conversation would change everything between us. Once the truth was out, there would be no going back. I could feel the anxiety in my chest, a knot that refused to loosen, and I knew that if I didn't take the step now, if I didn't say something, the guilt of keeping silence would crush me. But there was something else, something more important driving me forward, the recognition that my duty, not only as a grandfather but as a human being, was to protect Derek from the path he was on, a path that would lead him into more than just lies. It would lead him into consequences he was not prepared to face, consequences that would ruin him and everyone around him. I called him into the living room, my voice steady, though the nerves threatened to betray me. Derek came reluctantly, his shoulders hunched as if bracing himself for an argument he knew was coming but didn't understand. He had no idea that the quiet tension of the past few days had been building toward this moment, a moment I had been preparing for in secret, even though I knew it might shatter the very foundation of what little connection we had left. "Sit down, Derek," I said, my voice softer than I intended. As I gestured to the armchair opposite me, he slumped into it, still clutching his phone, clearly expecting yet another lecture about his behavior or his phone habits, something I had done countless times before without effect. But today, the conversation was not going to be about his manners or his use of Wi-Fi. It was going to be about something far deeper, something he could no longer brush off as an old man's ramblings. "Do you remember when you mocked me for not understanding how to use the internet?" I asked, trying to ease into the conversation to frame it gently before the truth overwhelmed him. He nodded, his face unreadable. "You said I was too old, that I couldn't even figure out how to use Wi-Fi." Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wanting to dismiss it, but I pressed on, speaking slowly, deliberately, because I knew that this conversation, this revelation, could only be understood in its entirety if I made him face it head on. "You were right in a way. I didn't understand it at first, but I do now, Derek. I understand it better than you think. And what I've learned is something I wish I didn't know." His eyes flickered with a hint of confusion, and for a moment I wondered if he truly didn't grasp where this was heading, or if he was simply trying to avoid it. I could see the walls of defense going up in his mind, the armor he had worn for so long to hide his fear and guilt. But it was too late to turn back. I had made up my mind to break through those walls. "I know what you've been doing, Derek," I continued, my voice unwavering. "I know about the money you've been moving around, the people you've been dealing with. I know about the scams, the lies you've built your little world on, and I know you've been using this house, this family, as a cover for it." His face went pale, and for the first time I saw true fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that comes from knowing you've been caught in something you can't escape. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. I let the silence hang there for a moment, the weight of the accusation hanging like a storm cloud, because I knew I couldn't let him talk his way out of it. This time, he had to listen. "I've seen the transactions, Derek," I said. My tone softer now, more like a father's than a grandfather's. "I've seen how much money has passed through your hands, how you've been lying to your mother, to me, to yourself. Do you know what this means?" His mouth moved, but his voice was barely a whisper. "It's not what you think, Grandpa. It's just a way to make money. Everybody's doing it. I didn't mean to get caught up in it, but I had to. I needed the money. For the things I want," I shook my head, feeling a strange mixture of pity and anger rise in me. "It's not about needing money, Derek. It's about what kind of person you're becoming. This isn't just about buying things. This is about betraying your own values, your integrity. This is about losing yourself in the process." The words hit him harder than I expected. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "I didn't want this, okay?" he yelled, suddenly breaking down, his voice cracking with the weight of his emotions. "I just wanted to prove I could do something. That I wasn't just the stupid kid who doesn't know anything. You don't get it. You and Mom, you don't understand what it's like to be young and have no opportunities. To see everyone else living a better life while you're stuck doing nothing." I sat still, watching him, and for the first time I saw the depth of his fear, his desperation, his belief that this path was the only one available to him. He wasn't just stealing money, he was trying to prove his worth, trying to fill the emptiness inside him with something that would make him feel important, validated, powerful. "I understand more than you think," I said softly, my voice filled with the weight of years spent working, struggling, and living through hardships. "But this isn't the way, Derek. This isn't how you build a future. You can't build a life on lies. You can't buy your way out of what you're running from." He looked at me then, his eyes full of something that resembled shame, but there was still a spark of defiance in him. "What am I supposed to do now, huh?" he spat, his voice still edged with anger but now mixed with desperation. "You're just going to turn me in, tell Mom, ruin my life over a few stupid mistakes?" I stood up slowly, my heart heavy but resolute. "I'm not going to ruin your life, Derek. But if you don't stop this now, if you don't take responsibility for what you've done, it's going to ruin you. It already has, to some extent. And I can't sit by and watch that happen." For a long moment we stood there, facing each other. Two people who had once shared a bond that had now been strained to the breaking point. And then, for the first time, I saw something in Derek's face that made me believe he might still have a chance. Regret. It was fleeting, but it was there. "I don't want to be like this," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I just don't know how to get out of it." I don't know how to fix everything. I stepped closer to him then, placing a hand on his shoulder, not in anger, but in an attempt to connect, to remind him that he wasn't alone in this. "You start by telling the truth, Derek. You face what you've done, and you make it right. You go to your mom, to the people you've hurt, and you fix it. But you have to make that choice." His eyes flickered with something I hadn't seen before, a glimmer of hope, the possibility that he could still change. But it was up to him now. The ball was in his court, and the next move was his. The days that followed our confrontation were neither easy nor quick. In fact, they felt like a slow unraveling, as though the fabric of the relationship I had spent years trying to maintain was being picked apart thread by thread. Derek barely spoke to me, his silence louder than any words could have been. And though I knew he was wrestling with guilt and fear, I couldn't help but feel the weight of that silence pressing down on both of us. Margaret, for her part, remained in the dark, still unaware of what had transpired between Derek and me. I didn't tell her immediately, knowing that Derek would need to be the one to speak the truth to her, to face the consequences of his actions. I couldn't carry that burden for him, and I wasn't sure even then if he was ready to face it himself. But I knew this much. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending that things could go back to the way they were before. The breakthrough came nearly a week later. On a cold morning, when I found Derek sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded, looking more like a boy than the young man he had tried to convince me he was. His eyes were red, and he didn't meet my gaze at first, but I could see the struggle within him, a silent plea for help buried beneath the layers of pride and shame he had carefully constructed over the years. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, looking out the window as though waiting for something, perhaps some sign from me, some assurance that he could still fix things. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," he said, his words heavy with the weight of his regret. "I know I messed up. I don't know how I let it get so far, but I can't keep lying to you or to Mom. I have to tell her I didn't respond immediately," letting his words sink in. Part of me wanted to reach out, to pull him into a hug and tell him it was going to be okay, but I knew better. The road ahead would not be easy for him, and I couldn't protect him from the fallout, no matter how much I wanted to. What he needed now was not comfort, but the courage to face the truth and deal with the consequences. I nodded slowly, my throat tight with emotion, and said simply, "It's a good start, Derek, but you have to be honest with your mother, with everyone. You can't undo what you've done, but you can start making it right." That afternoon, when Margaret returned home, Derek sat her down and told her everything. I could hear their voices from the other room, the sounds of anger, disbelief, and eventually, tears. Margaret's voice broke through the tension when she asked, "How could you do this, Derek? How could you lie to me for so long?" And Derek, to his credit, didn't offer excuses or try to justify his actions. He simply told her the truth, as painful as it was for both of them. He explained how he had gotten involved with the online schemes, how he had been promised quick money, how he had let himself become entangled in something he didn't understand, and how, in the end, he had hurt the people who mattered most to him. I knew it was hard for Margaret to hear, and I could hear her soft sobs through the walls. But what struck me most in that moment was not the anger or the disappointment in her voice, but the quiet sadness that lingered there, the grief for the son. She had failed to see fully the grief for the loss of trust between them. I knew that healing would take time, that the wounds would not close quickly. But there was something in the way Derek spoke, something in the way he accepted responsibility for his actions, that made me believe, for the first time in a long while, that maybe there was hope for him after all. It wasn't an immediate resolution, of course. The road to rebuilding trust was long, and there were no guarantees that things would ever be the same. But over the weeks that followed, Derek began to make amends, both with me and with Margaret. He spoke to the people he had wronged online, apologized, and began the process of returning the money he had stolen, though it would take time. Margaret and I, too, began to rebuild our relationship, though it was tentative at first, like two people who had once been close but had drifted apart over time. She had her own wounds to heal, wounds of her own guilt for not seeing the signs earlier, for not protecting Derek when she should have. I knew that the family we had once been was forever changed, but there was a part of me, a small part, that believed it could heal if we worked at it together. The healing was slow, as it always is when trust has been broken, but there were moments, fleeting but significant, when things seemed to shift. Derek started coming over more often, asking about my day, sitting with me at the kitchen table, even asking to learn how to cook some of the dishes Eleanor had once made. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. And when Margaret finally allowed herself to sit with me and talk about the past, about everything we had lost and everything we still had, I realized how far we had come. I had no illusions that we would ever return to the way things were before Derek's mistakes, but I had come to understand that some things could never be restored to their former state. What mattered now was that we were trying, that we were no longer living in silence, that we were no longer allowing our fears to keep us from facing the truth. One afternoon, not long after everything had begun to settle, Derek and I sat in the living room together, the same way we had before all of this had begun. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was simply a quiet understanding, a mutual respect that had slowly, painstakingly, been rebuilt. He was still the same boy, still imperfect and still making mistakes, but now there was a glimmer of something different in him, a sense of accountability, a desire to do better. He looked at me with a quiet sincerity and said, "Thanks for not giving up on me, Grandpa. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't said something." I smiled, though the smile was tinged with a sadness I could not quite shake. "It wasn't about giving up on you, Derek," I said softly. "It was about making sure you didn't give up on yourself." As we sat there, the silence between us no longer felt heavy. It felt like the first quiet breath after a storm, the first light after a long night. I realized that in some ways we had both learned something valuable from this experience, something that could only come from facing the hard truths and being willing to change. It hadn't been easy, and it still wouldn't be, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, I believed that things might just be okay after all.